Okay, good evening. Um, as the book of Bamidbar continues with relatively upsetting stories, this week, of course, is the rebellion of uh, of Korach against against Aaron. That there was, the I don't want to call it a debate. There was a rebellion against the rule of uh, of Aaron, and I don't really want to talk so much about Korach, but after this, they talk, I should say, Moshe Rabbeinu explains to the Levi'im. So Korach represents the Levi'im in our story. And so Moshe Rabbeinu describes to the Levi'im how they have a very specific role of their own in the Beit HaMikdash later and in the Mishkan, and that they make sure they should do their job. And so the job of the Levium is described in three verses in chapter 8 of Bamidbar, and these are three verses. And you're going to notice this one Hebrew word that really dominates these three verses. Vishamru mishmartecha, and you should. I don't know how to translate this. We're going to see a lot of translations for this term. I would have said guard, and you should guard your guarding. But the JPS, Jewish Publication Society translation that's in front of us says, they shall discharge their duties. So we're going to talk more about how to translate this word shmirah, lishmor, to guard, to be a guard. Okay. Umishmeret kala ohel. So they should discharge their duties for you, and they should also guard, keep track, be on top of the entire tent. Okay? Ach, el klei hakodesh, the el mizbech lo yikruvu. They're in charge of moving these things, making sure that nobody else comes near them, but they can't actually touch them. Only the Cohanim can actually touch certain of the utensils, furnishings of the temple later and the Mishkan in this time period. Okay, v'lo yikavu lo yametu. They shouldn't come close to things like certain utensils and to the altar itself and to the Aron, and therefore they won't die, which we know that if you touch certain of these items, you do die. There's this famous Haftarah from the book of Shmuel Bet, where David HaMelech is moving all of the temple items to Jerusalem that had been in Shiloh and then was stored after they were lost to the Philistines, the Plishtim. They were stored in Telstone, actually, is where we believe these things were stored until David HaMelech brings them to Yerushalayim, and someone named Uzziah touches the Aron and dies. So you have to be very careful. Don't touch these things. We're going to go back and talk about that idea in a few minutes. Gamheim, Gamatem. You should be careful not to touch them, and so the Levium. How much more so Yisraelim? The first of the three verses. The next verse, V'nilvu alecha, they shall be attached to you, is the translation here. I like a company, a Levoy, is like an armed guard, or like a when you see like the prime minister's car going down the highway and there are all of these police cars around it, those cars are called the Levoy. So sometimes it's an honor guard and sometimes it's for safety, but it means to accompany. To bring up something, we know funerals are called levayot because we're accompanying the deceased on their final journey. So that's a halvaya. So this is what it means. I would have said a company here. They should be attached to you. The Levi'im shall be attached to you, the Kohanim. V'shamru et mishberet ohel moed, and they should, again, the same terminology. We've got this shin mem resh, to guard or to watch or to discharge duties is the translation here. We've already got this 5 times in these 2 psukim. Okay, l'chol avodat ohel v'zer lo yikrav alechem, and an outsider, a stranger, should not, under any circumstances, get involved and get even close to these things. In this case, a zer means a non-Kohen and non-Levi. The term zer means an outsider, and it's a relative term depending upon the context. A zer could mean a non-Jew. Sometimes you go to like the airport, and you see a sign on a door that says, that it says asur lizarim, prohibited. It's illegal for a non-employee of the airport to go in there. In English, it says employees only. In Hebrew, it says asur lizarim, to strangers. So a zer is a relative outsider, depending upon what the context is. And here it means a non-Kohen, non-Levi, Israeli. Okay. The third verse in this series, ushmartam et mishmeret hakodesh, again, and you should discharge your duties, your holy duties, that mishmeret hamizbeach, and your responsibilities connected to the altar, v'lo yeh od katzef al bnei Yisrael, and so there should no longer be any divine anger against the nation. Because earlier in the parsha, of course, this fire comes out from Hashem and burns up the people that tried to bring sacrifices, and many of the people in the rebellion of Korah. So we don't want that to happen again. And if the Levi'im watch the utensils, the furnishings of the Beit HaMikdash and the Mishkan well enough, then this won't happen again. So we've got that term, Shin Mem Resh, in these 3 psukim 8 times. So we really have to talk about what does that term mean, and we'll come to that in just a couple of minutes. Let's start with the Sforno. So the Sforno says, "V'shamru mishmarto u'mishmeret ohel." The Levi'im, the Levites, are to guard the Holy of Holies, the structure, which in itself is your domain. So in other words, the instruction is given to the Kohanim, to Aharon and his descendants, about the Levi'im. So the Levi'im guard this stuff, but really you're the only one who actually goes in there. It's your domain. They're also to guard all the other sacred locations outside the Holy of Holies. And the ones housed in the tabernacle, comprising the table, the lampstand, the golden altar, they must not approach any of these things. So even though they have overall guard duty, protection for all these things, there are many of these things they can't touch. Even though they're guarding it, they can't actually touch most of these utensils. Please skip down to the Netziv. The Netziv, like I was pointing out as we read it just a minute ago, is interesting, the fact that we have 3 psukim continually repeating this word shmirah, shomer, to be in charge of. And he says there are 3 shmirot. There are 3 areas that require protection, guarding, people of them. And and each one of the verses talks about one of them. One of them, shmirah, for the preparation of the offerings, that they be ready at the proper time, and to make sure that they were raised correctly and fed. I mean, this goes back to the birth of these animals. You're supposed to watch them over. So that's the first thing. Or the beginning of the planting, if we're talking about grain offerings. Number 2, shmirah of the utensils of the mikdash and the facility itself, the physical facility of the building is also a shmirah. So we've got the preparation of the things which are going to be offered, then the facility itself, and the third one is shmirah for the divine service itself. Now, this one is less the Levi'im, even though we know there are Levi'im who sing and watch over the divine service, but most of the divine service shmirah is on the Cohanim, a little less on them. So therefore, there are 3 verses. Each one of the 3 verses describes a different aspect of the shmirah responsibility of the Levi'im specifically. I'm going to ask you please to flip to the back side of the sheet. And on the back side of the sheet, the second paragraph is sort of a mishmash of things. I put together a few relatively modern commentaries on the funny language. What does shmirah mean? So I would mean shmirah. I was in the army. We did shmirah. It was guard duty. Here, shmirah has to do with discharging duties. It's a little bit different. So JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, explains how they translated it as discharging duty. The main role of the Levites is guard duty. So mishmeret really is guard duty. He translated as discharge their responsibilities, but it really means guard duty. I agree. They are charged with guarding the tabernacle from encroachers, outsiders, curious onlookers, right? They have to guard it from these people. While it is stationary and guard its furnishings during travel. So they're in charge once the building is put up, to make sure nobody goes where they shouldn't go. And when it's moving, that again, nobody comes over and touches or interferes with anything. Okay. The purview of the priests is the interior of the tabernacle, its sacred objects, and performing the rites associated with them. Any outsider that is a non-priest is forbidden contact with the holy place and the holy articles on penalty of death. And that's also in our verses. Levite guard duties of the tabernacle and its contents protect the Israelites from the consequences of encroachment. Now, you might think that they're guarding the Mishkan, but this translation, whoever wrote this commentary for JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, says, no. They're not guarding the Mishkan. They're guarding the Israelim to make sure they don't do things they shouldn't do and get hurt. Okay. These Levite guard duties in the tabernacle and its contents protect the Israelites from the functionaries attached, from the consequences of encroachment. These verses also contain an etymology of Levite. The middle verse, Venilvu, that these are cultic functionaries attached from the root lamed ve vav he, to accompany. The Levites are the accompaniers of the Cohanim and of the building itself. It's interesting that in our verses we're being told sort of why they're called Levi'im. They are cultic functionaries attached to the priests. Okay, Professor Robert Alter, who recently came out with a translation of the entire Tanakh. It's been his life work. He's in his 80s, and he's still a professor of biblical literature at Berkeley. And his comment on our verses, as elsewhere, the Hebrew mishmeret has a military sense. I don't think you really get that when you read our verses. But he says that's what the root really means, mishmar hagavul, the border police, magavnikim, mishmar, that the shin mem resh really does have military sense, to keep watch or guard, but it may also refer to something like maintenance. And here it's more maintenance. The Hebrew nilvu, he's also talking about from our middle verse, means to be joined, but is an obvious pun on Levi. So he doesn't agree with JPS. JPS says this may be where the terminology came from, and Alter instead says, no. that Moshe Rabbeinu was making a pun on on the already existing name of the Levi'im. Okay. Then last comment from Rabbi Aryeh Levin, which I just found interesting. This expression, V'shamru mishmartecha u'mishmeret, appears in our verse, but also in Parshat Bamidbar in chapter 3, verse 7. And there he translates it, they shall safeguard my trust. Here he translates it in our chapter 18, they shall be your associates and they shall be entrusted. It's just fascinating that the exact same three-word combination is translated very differently by Rabbi Kaplan in different places. I think he was right back in chapter 3. I think here he's not translating. I think he was trying to explain, and it's a little bit different. But anyways, just wanted to share that. I want to go back now to the Chizkuni on the front side. Okay, the Chizkuni says, V'zar lo yikrav aleichem. So now he's emphasizing outsiders. That's us. That's the Yisraelim, the people who know neither Kohen nor Levi. And a stranger, non-Levite or priest, shall not approach you. We have heard the warning, but where is the penalty for violation spelled out? Look at verse 7. And it says, where the Torah spells it out, V'hazar hakarev yumat. And if a stranger approaches, he shall die. Now, I want to skip straight to Rabbeinu Bechaye, who's going to talk about this. What does it mean he will die? It doesn't say mot yumat, or or that he's taken to court and gets one of the punishments of the court. Instead, it says, and he will die. So what does that mean? Look in the Rabbeinu Bechaye discusses it. So that not both you and they shall die. This is the sort of the halach, source of the halacha, that the functions of the Levites are not interchangeable. Okay, so he's on another point. He's going to get to the point about killing in just a second. Oh, really? No, that's really the Maharal's going to do. He's talking about the separation of powers. That we think of this idea of separation of powers as like a modern governmental concept. But the Chizkuni, Rabbeinu Bechaye is trying to explain to us, no. This idea of separation of powers, that everybody has to stay in their own lane and take care of their responsibility and not allow others, in. This is an ancient idea that we started. There's Cohanim, they do the service. There's the Levi'im, they sing, and they also they also are in charge of all of the utensils and apparatus. And then there's the everybody else, the Israelim, who bring their donations and participate in from the outside. Okay. This is the source for the halacha that the functions of the Levites are not interchangeable, that a priest may not perform functions designated for the Levite, nor the Levite functions reserved for the priest. Everybody has to do their own thing and nobody else. Everybody has to stay in their lane. Not only this, but even priests who have been assigned certain tasks must not exchange their duties with other priests who have been assigned different priestly assignments. It was very important. Everybody in the Beit HaMikdash, starting in the Mishkan, but later in the Beit HaMikdash, very specialized. Everybody did their job over and over again, and they became experts at their little part of the whole picture. With his different, nor must Levites exchange duties within the framework of what is their exclusive domain. If a Levite was assigned the duty to play an instrument or participate in the songs the Levites sing, he must not instead engage in washing the hands of the priests. Now, as if he has to stick to again, keeping his lane. He's got to do his responsibility because we're afraid that certain jobs won't get done. if people are, say, oh, that looks interesting, let me participate, let me get involved with that. Today, we think of the Levites mostly washing the priest's hands. That's like their big role. But it used to be that they were the choir and the orchestra for all of the beautiful music that took place in the Beit HaMikdash. Okay. This is why the Torah writes, each man to his designated task. This is the way these words have been defined in the Sifri, that's the halachic midrash. The words, but to the holy vessels and the altar they shall not approach, are a warning, whereas the words falling so they will not die are the Torah's way of spelling out the penalty for non-observance of the warning. The words gamheim, they also are the source for the inadmissibility of exchanging duties, either by mutual consent or willful preempting the duties assigned to somebody else, to a colleague. Okay, so it's very important, and that's one of the reasons why the term vishamru, keep your role, keep your guard, is emphasized and repeated, because everybody has to do their assigned role. Okay, the Maharal is more concerned with this business about the death of people that they come into contact with utensils that they had no business coming into contact with, which again takes place in Shmuel Bet. Uzzah touches the Aron and dies on the spot. For if they touch it, they will be liable for death at the hand of heaven. What is that? What's that mean? This means that they shall die is not connected to they shall not touch. Normally, we don't say, oh, you do this and you'll die. First we say, don't do this. And then we say the court executes such people. Here it just says they shall die. But why? For why should they be liable for death? Rather, it means that if they touch, they shall die. It's not a punishment. It's a result, and it's immediate. And that's what happened on the spot. That when you touch certain items, specifically the Aron itself, but it could include the contents of the Aron, the contents of the ark, which might mean the tablets or other items. Okay, you die immediately. And that which he writes at the hand of heaven, in the Midrash it says that it's mita b'dei shamayim. You die at the hands of heaven. I've already explained in Parshat Emor that whenever it is written, they shall not touch lest they die, it refers to the death at the hand of heaven and not death at the hands of man or the courts. For if it is a death at the hand of man, if the courts are going to take such a person and execute them, the situation is very different. It is possible that one would touch and not die. Why? For example, where witnesses do not testify against words. In other words, the courts don't always succeed in prosecuting correctly everyone that commits a capital crime. But so here it doesn't say, don't do it, and the courts can put them to death. Here it says you're going to die because it happens immediately by the hands of heaven. Okay. But here they shall not touch lest they die, for the death that is mentioned relates to they shall not touch. For he, God, warned them not to touch, because if they touch, they will certainly die on the spot immediately. That is to say, touching will certainly bring about death at the hand of God, but not at the hand of man. Know that the words of the sages are very evident to one who understands words of wisdom. Now, if you're used to reading these kinds of texts, you understand why our sages explain it this way. For the truth is that the soul carries the body, and therefore it is also fitting that the ark should carry its bearers. Now, our living ability to walk and talk and move and participate, that's my soul inside. My Tselem Elokim, my life force that comes from heaven, that motivates, that animates my body. And so what the Maharal wants to say is that's the same thing that's true with the Aron. The Aron wasn't carried by the Levites. The Levites just were shomrim. It was moving itself. For the soul rests in the body. This is because the soul is not completely separate, and therefore it rests in the body. And similarly with the priests who carried the ark. But when there was a miracle, and this is because the power of the ark was revealed, for it was because of the power of the ark that the Jordan split. The ark certainly carried its bearers. It wasn't carried, it carried the Cohanim and Levi'im who ministered to it. These are words of wisdom. This is something that is like, something that's a little bit off the beaten track and not everybody understands, but it is an idea of chachma. And so with Uzzah, who of course was the one who died when mistakenly trying to be a good guy. He thought that the Aron was going to fall off the wagon, that it was being transported on from Kiryat Yearim, which is today Telstone, to Yerushalayim. He reached out, touched it, and died. But he made a mistake because it wouldn't have fallen, because it carries itself. And when the ox slipped and he touched it, God, smote him. Nevertheless, he did not deserve to die, as he had acted unintentionally. Courts would never have executed such a person. So here it's not a punishment. It's a result of touching it, that the power of it brings about a fatal action. But taking hold of it prepared him for death, as he should have known that the ark carries its bearers. And Aharon and his sons made the covering of the holy furniture. After that, the sons of Kahat shall come to bear them. Therefore, Aaron is mentioned in the words to the sons of Kahat, for the entire burden of Kahat, and all the service was given to them by Aharon and his sons, as they themselves were not permitted to touch the ark or any of the vessels until they covered them. The Cohanim covered them, then the Levi'im could transport them and move them. As it says, and when Aaron is covered and made an end of covering the holy furniture, then the Levi'im could move them. So we've got a very clear separation of responsibilities between the Cohanim and the Levi'im. So clear that even in their own responsibilities, they can't switch with somebody else. Everybody is a specialist. Okay, we think of specialization as being a relatively modern invention, but it was definitely existed in the Beit HaMikdash, and I assume in other parts of the ancient world that this kind of specialization did exist. The Sfat Emet wants to say something about this specialization. He doesn't want to talk about one being good and one being bad, but he is going to say that one is superior to the other. And how does this work? And of course, the comment of the Sfat Emet, of the second Ger Rebbe, becomes very important when understanding how terrible the behavior of Korach was, to say, oh, I don't like my job, I want your job. Okay, Aharon, the chutzpah, the nerve of you to make yourself, the boss. I want to be the boss. And so it's terrible, because the assignments, of course, came from Hashem. And so he wants us to understand the difference in the levels of responsibility. It says in the Zohar, the source of Jewish Kabbalah mystical thinking, Aharon is the right side. So if we look at the jobs of the Cohanim, we view that as in the spiritual realm, being on the right side of this imaginary picture of the different responsibilities. We're going to map it out. We're going to make an outline. So the jobs of the Cohanim would be on the right side. Right side is considered the superior side, the better side. I always am offended by this because I'm a lefty, but even the Gemara solved that problem by saying that for people who are lefties, really their left hand is their right hand. Itar yad yamino. He's just got a different right hand. Okay, so they're trying to make us feel a little bit better. Didn't help me use right-handed scissors when I was in preschool. But anyways, now you can get lefty scissors. So he says that Aaron and the Cohanim, they're the right side, which represents chesed, kindness, superior spirituality. Korach and the Levi'im, they're the left side. Their job, which is emphasized by the word shmirah, is more one of power rather than kindness. And that we view as not negative, but not as positive. It's still, we need both sides. We need both hands to survive. So Aaron is supposed to stay in his lane because his lane is the Yamin. And Korach is supposed to stay in his lane because his lane is the small. And you shouldn't confuse them because everybody should do the role that was assigned to them. Okay. And that explains why our Parsha is so upset with Korach. Therefore, Korach should submit himself to Aharon. Just like, Yitzchak submits, who's the right side, submits himself to his father and superior, Avram. Okay? And that is the role of the Levi'im. The Levi'im are the Shomrim, the guards for the Kohanim and for the temple. They are nilvu. They serve, accompany. They're not the star. They're the supporting cast. It's a beautiful role to play, and it's very important, but it's not the starring role. Therefore, the actual name Levi'im means to be supportive, accompany the Kohanim, as in Nilvu. So our verse is explaining why the Torah is so upset by the entire rebellion of Korach and why it was so inappropriate for him to stand up and do what he did, because they had their role, which is important and necessary, but unfortunately for them was considered less star-like than the other. For a movie to be great, the supporting actors have to be good too. This is similar to the attribute of justice, which should be subordinate to kindness. So when we look at the makeup of the Sfirot, kindness is on the right side, and that's the superior side. Justice and strength is on the left side, and that's more supporting and subordinate to kindness. So the jealousy of Korach for Aaron was a monumental error, because he was really, like I've been using the analogy all night, getting out of his lane and causing major accidents. For a person's purpose is to fulfill his role, his tafkid. The early part of the book of Bamidbar talks about the pikudim, the count of the people, but it's not just the count, it's the assignments. Every tribe has their assignments and roles to play, and that's very important. Everybody has to take their role seriously and fulfill it, which they are assigned. Moshe, in his aspect of representing Torah, wanted to make peace between the Kohanim on the right side and the Levi'im on the left side. But the Torah also has the concept of hara'at sha'ah, of emergency, momentary changes in the reality, which allowed the temporary permission for them to bring their incense outside the Mishkan. It was the most famous case in the Bible of hara'at sha'ah, an exception to the rule for an emergency situation, was Eliyahu. Eliyahu brings a sacrifice on Har Carmel in Haifa when it is normally prohibited to bring any sacrifices outside the temple. But it was a necessary emergency exception so that the nation could see that God supports Eliyahu in his major fight with Ahav, the king. Okay. But when Korach and others didn't accept the result, Din became predominant and punished those who didn't accept the ruling. Okay, so we've spent all this time until 40 minutes in, describing how everybody has specific roles, everybody has jobs to do, and everybody should make sure they do their job and not somebody else's job. Now, this is interesting and fine, and is the way the temple is supposed to function, but is this the way we're supposed to function? I mean, is everybody supposed to be a specialist in one thing in Judaism? Is that better than being a universalist or a jack of all trades? Should we just like at bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah give assignments? Okay, you're in charge of cooking, you're in charge of cleaning, you're in charge of singing, you're in charge of learning, you're in charge of leading services, you're in charge of laning. Should we just give assignments and everybody just stick to that one role? So Rabbi Leslie wanted to take this idea from this week's Parsha about everybody having sort of blinders and just keep staying in their lane and try to see if we as Jews could learn something from this. Does this require us to do this kind of tunnel vision in our lives? And so this is part of a much, much longer essay that Rabbi Lichtenstein Oliver Shalom wrote about 20 years ago. Just as Levi'im are prescribed from engaging in the labor of the Cohanim, likewise, Cohanim are prescribed from engaging in the labor of the Levi'im. That's what we've been talking about this whole evening so far. As it is written, both you and they. Similarly, Levi'im are forewarned that one should not engage in the labor of his fellow. The singer should not assist the gatekeeper, nor the gatekeeper the singer. Okay, we had a slightly different version of that when they talked about washing their hands as opposed to singing, but the same idea so far. Each person to his work and his labor. If a Levi performs the labor of a Kohen, or if one Levi assists another with regard to work which is not his, they are liable to death. Wow. Not just for touching. The Rabbi Aaron says that in the middle verse that we were talking about before, they shall be attached to you and at the end of the first verse, with the furnishing shrine or with the altar, lest both they and you die. In other words, Rabbi Aaron feels that in the temple, that lest you die means doing somebody else's job, not just touching incorrectly any of the articles in the temple. Okay, which is very harsh. Here we have a very clear example of institutionalized specialization in halakha. In other areas too, we find division of labor. By this I mean the rule of ha'osek b'mitzvah pator min a mitzvah. In other words, sometimes I'm doing a mitzvah and I'm supposed to finish that job before going on to another. In other words, I shouldn't be like, running around like a chicken without a head. Finish one, then go on to something else. A person who's engaged in performing a mitzvah is absolved from doing another mitzvah. The famous example is very sad. Let's say someone is involved in getting in a burial and it becomes time for reading Shema. Since he's involved already in this very important mitzvah, he is patur, totally free from reading Shema. Again, I'm in my lane, and I have to finish this before I can go to another lane. Is that the way all of Jewish life should be? According to Tosfot, it may very well be that the term patur, exempt, as applied to the osek, the person involved in performing the other mitzvah, may be a halachic misnomer. It is not that he is exempt. I mean, he's not really exempt because tomorrow he's going to have to say it. I mean, he's going to have to daven, it doesn't become totally free from it. It's just for this particular moment. But simply that pragmatically, if you have a choice between two mitzvot and I've already begun one mitzvah, then you should not leave the first mitzvah in order to do the second. It's not like I've turned myself into a Levi and I can't do anything else ever. It just means at this moment, it's not like the things we've been discussing so far this evening. This is not because you have become exempted from the second mitzvah. It is simply because these duties of both devolve upon you as an individual. Practically speaking, you can't do them both. You can't fulfill both. It's just practically impossible, or at least very difficult. I do not believe that we should be looking, and now there's a big section here where he talks about, is that the way we should be in our lives? Should people look to specialize in just a few kinds of mitzvot? Or should we try to be encyclopedic in our approach to halachic norms? I do not believe that we should be looking for a single clear solution which can be applied uniformly across the board. In other words, in the Torah, the Levi, the Cohen, they were told, this is your job, that's it. But for the rest of it, and that can exist. Somebody can say, all I do is learn Torah. Someone can say, all I do is daven, is say Tehillim, and I minimize doing other activities. The Rabbi thinks that that's permitted to do such a thing. But what happens if I want to be eclectic? I want to do all sorts of different things in my Jewish life, which I love to do. I mean, I want to do the mitzvot involved with cooking and baking, as well as the mitzvot involved with learning Torah and davening. And he says, should we try to find a solution for everybody? He says, I do not believe we should be looking for a single clear solution which can be applied uniformly across the board. I can't make up a rule about specialization in the general Jewish population that should be applied to everybody. Uniformity in this case is neither attainable nor desirable. The mix of Torah, learning, studying, avoda, davening, worship, and gemilah chasadim, being kind to others, giving charity, helping, is one which is to be individually conceived and perceived. We're supposed to work on doing all of Torah. This part of the Torah about the Cohen and the Levi is an exception, according to Rabbi, to the norm. The norm is we do it all. Is one to be individually conceived and perceived in one proportion for one individual and a different proportion for another. So in other words, everybody can, I've got to do all three, but I'm going to be 50% Torah and only, 25% of the other two. I'm going to be 80% Gemilas Chesed and minimize the others. You can decide what the breakup is, but everybody should be doing everything. In trying to determine the course of one's spiritual growth, as opposed to the psukim we read this evening, a person needs to bear in mind the objectives relevant to it with an eye to the fusion of these two elements: to grow personally while contributing generally. I'm going to read that phrase again. I like it. To grow personally while contributing generally. The Cohanim and the Levi'im majored in contributing generally. That was their major role in the community and their own personal growth and personal satisfaction remained small. They were just assigned to do all of these things for the community at large. And they just had to do those things and often couldn't take care of many other issues. That's not the way we are. We have to look for our own mix of the categories: Torah, Avoda, Gemilas Chasadim. And we also have to look for the mix between things that have to do with my own personal growth, sitting there and studying on my own, or giving classes and helping others and teaching others. Everybody has to decide what is their personal mix, how much. Everybody has to work on their own personal development, but how much of their effort should be placed in that effort. Look, when I was young and in yeshiva, I think it should have been the majority of my effort. But as I become a parent and a teacher, I think my personal needs become less important to what I have to offer and to do for the community at large. Now that I'm retired, I think I've gone back a little bit. I think I'm more focused on myself a little bit more than when I was, a full-time rabbi and educator. But everybody has to ask themselves these questions. And according to Rabbi Aaron, it's the verses here about the specialization of Aharon versus Korach, which raise the issue of what should I be doing? How should I be allotting my spiritual schedule? A person needs to bear in mind the objectives relevant to it with an eye to the fusion of the two elements to grow personally while contributing generally. In that way, he or she must strive for the interaction of Torah, Avoda, and Gemilas Chasadim while trying at the same time to grow and contribute on a personal level. Rabbi Aaron takes the unusual circumstance of mishmeret, and I'm going to suggest that Rabbi Aaron would say the word mishmeret in our context means confine yourself to these categories. The idea of mishmeret is rare and small in the spiritual realm. Most of us are just supposed to be viewing the bigger picture and be more involved generally with all of the myriad aspects of Torah, Avoda, Gemilas Chasadim, and simultaneously be applying those three areas both for my personal growth and for my contributions to society at large. Even though there are some specialists in Torah, and we see, the Cohanim and Levi'im, the Aaron Korach debate, but in general, most of us are supposed to be really, really out there and be as collegial as possible, spreading as much of what we have to contribute as we possibly can. And the idea of there being specialists becomes very, very rare. And I think this is important in our generation too, because we tend to see parts of the Jewish society today that tend to say, oh, we're specialists in Torah study, and that frees us from all sorts of other things. I'm not sure it does. I think that we have to continually weigh personal growth and societal needs. And I think Rabbi Aaron is right, that the case described in our parsha, in these three psukim, is a rare reality. The true reality is everybody has to be involved in many aspects of Torah and life, and both personal growth and communal commitment and ahavat ha'acher, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, is the greatest principle. So personal growth is important, but ultimately we have to make sure that we're contributing to our fellow Jew. And I wish that this was something that was taught across the board in schools in general, but in yeshivot And I think it's very important that everybody see that that we have to balance all of these many different realities in our lives, and saying, "Oh, I just do this." I think they're missing. I think they're missing the point. The point of these verses are these were an exception to the rule. The mishmeret, which word gets repeated 8 times in these 3 verses, is to say this was unusual and exclusively for them, rarely to be applied in other circumstances. Even though we see in our society today that some people want to say, "Oh, no, I'm on the mishmeret team, and I can only do this, and I can't do anything else." And I think that's a mistake. I think it's a problem for society. And I hope all of us try to listen to this great advice of Rabbi Lichtenstein at the end of explaining what was meant in these difficult verses. Okay, thank you very much for joining this evening. Let people know the recording, Be'ezrat Hashem, will be up tomorrow. Okay, see you next week. And after next week, we'll be off for a long time. I'm sorry. Maybe I'll try to figure out a time around Tisha B'Av that we can maybe get together just for like for one time. Okay, thanks for joining tonight. Have a good evening and a great week. And Chodesh Tov. Chodesh Tov. Chodesh Tov. And Gail, happy anniversary. Okay, bye-bye.
Anniversary. Chodesh Tov. Thank you.